Happy holidays, everybody, and happy National Ice Cream Day. If you are watching the recording of this Lunchinar because you missed the live Lunchinar while you were out celebrating National Ice Cream Day, I completely understand. Welcome to our Lunchinar on preparing for a school Medicaid audit. My name is Bob Bundy. I am the presenter for today's session. I've got my contact information on the screen while I cover our quick ground rules for the Lunchinar. First, all of our Lunchinars are targeted at 30 minutes. We don't talk about anything state specific on the Lunchinars. A little bit about our Lunchinar series. We try and give at least one Lunchinar every month during the school year on school Medicaid. All the Lunchinars we give are designed to present information on one topic that we think folks in school Medicaid should be aware of. Here are my objectives for the session today. First, I'd like to list a group of strategies that might help you make a plan for preparing for one of your school Medicaid audits. Then I'm going to give you some ideas of ways to make things easier on you and your staff, and even more, make things easier on your auditors. And I'll talk about why that's a positive all the way around. We also want to talk about ways that you can minimize the amount of time the audit takes. Get the auditors back to their office or onto their next assignment, which they really love because they don't want to just sit in a file room for days and days and days, and gets them out of your office so you don't have to always be answering lots and lots of questions that auditors always have. Now, I'm going to talk today about two different kinds of audits. There's the regular school Medicaid audit, and then we'll talk about some extraordinary or special audits that you might encounter. The first one is the regular audit. And you know, every state Medicaid agency has the obligation to audit its Medicaid program. And that's not just school Medicaid, that's all Medicaid programs, hospitals, doctors' offices, nursing homes, clinics, and schools. So school Medicaid is not unusual in that it is audited. Every state has a little, states have different approaches in how they handle school Medicaid audits. So I'm aware of states that audit every school district every quarter. I'm also aware of states that have a self-audit sort of a program that school districts participate in, and other ones where states have sort of a rotating schedule. You might not be audited this year, but you might be audited in 2 years, or you don't know exactly when, but it's going to happen every 3 years for sure. So states have different approaches in how they do that. Regardless of the type of audit process, your state will let you know when you are being audited in this normal Medicaid audit. You'll get some sort of notice, either a letter or an email or something like that. And I've got a mocked up letter here. This is not taken from any particular state, but it's sort of a model based on different letters or different notices that I've seen across the country. And basically it says your program's going to be audited. It's going to be either a desk audit, which means we're going to stay in our office to audit you. You're going to send us all your records. Or we're going to be in your office, in your school district, going through your records in your office. They're going to give you some kind of notice that. They're going to tell you when it is. They're going to tell you what kind of records you need to produce. And they're going to list the services that they'll be auditing. And down at the bottom here, again, I know you may not be able to read this on the slides, but basically this is sort of listing, you know, the student. Of course, to the Medicaid agency, they're either a patient or a client, but the student who received the service, the day they received the service, who provided the service, and what service is being audited. So you're going to get that sort of notice, and they're going to tell you what information you need to provide to support the audit. Of course, if this is a desk audit, meaning you're going to be sending information to the auditors in the mail or something like that, they've got to obviously tell you exactly what records they want to see. But even if they're coming to your office and they're going to sit there, they'll give you notice about what kind of records they want to see. Now, if it's a direct services audit, so your school system is providing direct medical services, you know, speech, PT, OT, nursing, audiology, counseling, all that kind of stuff. You're providing those direct services. These are the type of records they will typically tell you to provide. First, they want to see the proof of delivery. They want to see the clinical note or the session note or the therapy note, whatever it might be called in your state, that the provider completed. And it basically says something like, I met with Bob today for 30 minutes. We worked on range of motion of his shoulder. We did these exercises and Bob's progress was like this. You know, that sort of note. And they want to see, one, that it was delivered on the day that the claim says it was delivered, and they want to see that it was signed, whether it was manually signed or electronically signed. Different states have different requirements. Most states now will handle electronic signatures or accommodate that, but there are a few that still have manual signatures. Now, if this is direct service coming from services listed on a student's IEP, they'll want to see information from that IEP. They'll want to see the services page and the signatures and the goals and the present levels. I'm going to talk a little bit about free care near the end of the presentation, where they might be looking at services that are not listed on a student's IEP, and we'll talk about that. But for now, since this historically is kind of what they're looking for, this is the kind of information you need to have available from the IEP. They probably want to see the evaluation that covers this IEP that indicates a need for whichever service you provided. Speech therapy, they'll want to see in the evaluation excuse me, that speech therapy was called for. And then there, depending on the state, there may be other mandatory documentation. So here in Arizona, the state where I live, school districts are required to have pre-approval from the state Medicaid agency before they can bill for personal care services, which in Arizona are called health aid services. So before they can bill for that, school district has to actually send in the IEP to the Medicaid agency. They review it and they give them a pre-approval that says, yes, you can bill for reimbursement for that service. In the state of Mississippi, they have the same sort of pre-approval, but it's for every service. In Mississippi, it's called a treatment authorization. Regardless of what your state's additional requirements might be, when the auditors come, they're going to want access to that information. So here in Arizona, if they're auditing a personal care or a health aid service, you better believe they want to see the pre-approval for that service. Now, there are other records that you should have available. Not every auditor wants to see it every single time. Two of them that I'm going to note here. One is the proof of student attendance. A few years ago, well, no, not a few years ago, when OIG reports audit findings from around the country, one of the #1 findings they have year after year is that school districts could not prove that the student was in school the day the service was provided. And, they're looking at attendance records and those sort of things. And so I've got to say, normally I wouldn't call that out. And you see, I don't even have it highlighted here, but it's one of the things that comes up over and over and over every single year. So it's something to pay attention to. And the other one that I've got there is parental consent. Years ago, parental consent was sort of glossed over during school Medicaid audits. And here's why. Parental consent lives, and those regulations live over on the education side of the house, IDEA, FERPA, that kind of stuff. Well, the Medicaid auditors who come in and audit your records are from the Medicaid agency in your state, or a contractor working for the Medicaid agency of your state. And that comes under the authority of CMS. They're looking at all the Medicaid rules, and parental consent is over there on education. A lot of times auditors for school Medicaid didn't even know about parental consent. So for years it slipped through the cracks. It doesn't slip through the cracks anymore. And there were some OIG audit findings in the last 2 years that actually called out parental consent, which tells you that even though Medicaid is a program over here under the Department of Health and Human Services, they are now looking for the parental consent and covered by the regulations over on the IDEA and FERPA side. So that's the direct services audit. But what if you're being audited for your administrative claiming program? Administrative claiming, remember, is where your school district is doing general community outreach, educating the community about Medicaid programs available in the state. Maybe they're meeting with parents and enrolling them or helping them enroll in some Medicaid programs offered in your state. And That could be an assistant principal or a school counselor or a social worker, somebody like that. They're not providing direct medical service. They're just helping this family get enrolled or information about the Medicaid program. Now, the reason I bring this up is that, again, recently being within the last 2 years, OIG published an audit from a state someplace, and I don't have it in my notes here, but basically it said we audited the administrative claiming program. And one of the biggest findings we had was that school districts could not prove that that person, whether it was an assistant principal or a counselor, could not prove that that person actually met with those people providing that service when they said they did, providing that information, that community outreach. And so we're going to disallow that. Well, what kind of proof were they looking for? They were looking for things like calendar appointments. And of course, we all know in school districts, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes families just walk in. You know, they're new to the community. They're going to register their kids, whatever it is. There's no appointment. And so, of course, I don't have anything in my day planner for that. I don't have anything for in my Outlook or my online calendar for that. They wanted to see what we might consider like a session note. You know, yes, I spent 15 minutes talking to the family about Medicaid programs, and this is what we talked about. Very few school districts had been collecting that. Now, the reason I bring that up is since that was in an OIG audit finding, and since the majority of states have an administrative claiming program, that's probably an issue that could come up again and again. So the recommendation that I have for school districts or billing companies, because I've noticed that a lot of billing companies are participating on the Lunchinars, which I really love. But a lot of school districts use software systems for their providers, their speech therapists, their nurses, to document services. And a lot of those software products come from your billing company. One of the recommendations that I have is that you either work with your billing company, or if you're a billing company, look at your software to figure out if there are ways that you can either adapt it to be used by the people who do administrative claiming, you know, so like assistant principals or counselors or those kind of people, to just record the same kind of session notes that your service providers record to document their services. Some of you are out there from really huge school districts. You may have your own software system that your own programming team generates, and that would be something to investigate. My experience with software in this area is pretty significant, and I think that most software packages that billing companies provide could be easily adapted just with some different codes and setups, so that not a school nurse, a guidance counselor could go in and log a session and said, you know, I met with this family today and we talked about this with the Medicaid stuff, and it lasted, you know, from 10 o'clock to 10:15. That way, if the random moment time study comes out and says, what were you doing at 10:07 yesterday? They say, I was talking about Medicaid. They'd actually have documentation to back it up. Now, a couple of strategies about preparing for these audits. This is the regular audit that your state is notifying you about. First, start compiling your data right away. Most states will give you plenty of notice. The audit, your records are due 2 weeks from today or 3 weeks from today, or we're going to be in your office 3 weeks from today. And these are the records we want to audit, and this is the information you need to provide. So just like the term paper at school, you don't want to wait till the night before. You know, with that, the term paper, you might have been able to crank it out the night before and get it turned in and maybe get a decent grade. But here with the Medicaid audit, you've got to compile all this information. You've got to compile documents that have signatures on them, and you've got to compile them from this file and this file over here, and you've got to put it all together. You might be missing something. It might be someplace in your school system, but you don't know where it is. And of course, if you're waiting till the night before, the day before the auditors are coming, or the day before you have to stick this in the mail, you could be in serious trouble. Basically basically turning in an incomplete information, which means you're going to fail your audit in that area. Most auditors that I've ever talked to, if the record isn't there, when they're there, the record isn't there, and they're going to mark it as not there. Even if you find it an hour after they leave and call them and say, hey, I found it. Well, it wasn't there when we were there. Sometimes they make an exception, but very rarely. So start right away. give yourself plenty of time to uncover the paperwork that might be in a different building, or it might be with a provider someplace, especially providers who manually document their clinical notes. Might have it someplace, but it's not in your file room, and you don't want to wait to the last second and try and find it. A couple more here. Organizing your data. It's really important, and I always recommend this to all my customers, is organizing your data and use a cover sheet. So remember that letter that I showed you at the beginning notifying you of an upcoming audit. It listed 10 or 12 services. Make a cover sheet for every service. And this is an audit cover sheet template that's out on our website. You can go out to the resources tab, grab it, modify it for your own use. That's fine. Basically, you need to list all the items that you need to have, all the paperwork you need to have to support that claim. So here you can see, and again, maybe you can't read it because it's small, the IEP goals page and the IEP signatures page and the parental consent and the provider's license that was valid the day that the service was provided. All these things. Basically, you're going to go through this stuff before the auditors do. You say, I got this, I got this, I got this. It's a good checklist for the information you need to collect, but it's also a great visual resource for the auditors when they come in. I always recommend that if they're going to audit, 10 services, you have a cover page for each service. You put all the required documentation behind the cover page and you set it in a pile. So they just start going through, boom, 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 and it's all right there. To go along with this cover page and this organization, tab the pages. So here we have the cover page. I generally recommend to my customers that they put a number next to each one. So maybe the IEP goal page has a number 3 next to it, and the signatures has a 4, and the parental consent has a 5. And then the paperwork that's behind the cover page, you tab it with those numbers. So I'm an auditor. I sit down. Here's a cover page that lists everything that I told them I want to see, and they have them all checked off saying, yes, they have them, and here are the tabs. I could probably spend half an hour going through 10 records if it's laid out like that, and I'm done, and they pass, and I'm gone. I'm out of their office. That's a really cool way to make your audit go fast. It's a really cool way to give the auditors access to the information. And to the next point, you give the auditors only what they're after. This is a really big deal for a couple different reasons. I always tell customers, do not give the auditors additional information. If they if they say they're auditing the 2014-2015 school year and they need the IEP, then give them just that IEP. Do not plunk down a 6-inch folder in front of them with 10 years worth of stuff and let them wade through it. Now, there are a couple reasons for that. One, it's going to slow them down. Two, there's kind of the FERPA, there's the FERPA issue. If they're looking for something in the 2014-2015 school year and you give them access to that kid's IEP from 2012-2013, that's information they have no need to see. And that's actually a disclosure that you're not supposed to be giving them. Now, probably nobody's going to call you on that, but it's a FERPA issue there. And then the last thing is that when auditors are going through records, if they come across something that concerns them, even if it's not in the area that they're looking for, if it's something of a concern of an audit issue, they have an obligation to investigate it. So they're looking at the 2014-2015 school year and you give them all the students' IEPs. They start going through, they get to the 2013-2014 or whatever numbers I said, they get to the year before and they see something in there that's a concern to them. They have an obligation to either stop and investigate right then and ask you a million questions, or open up the audit and look at previous years, or go back to their office and come back and say, we need to look at lots of stuff. So give them access to only what they need. Okay, make it easy for this auditor. If you make it easy for them to get the information they need, they will be happy. If it's possible to make auditors happy. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I have 3 cousins who are auditors and they're all lovely people, but it also gets them out of your office. Not that you don't want them in your office because they're terrible people, but of course, when they're in your office, you always have to have somebody available to answer their questions until they're done. Now I'm going to talk real quickly about a special audit or an extraordinary audit. This is an audit that you may not get any notice. It may be run by a different agency than your school Medicaid agency. So for example, had a few years ago, a customer called and said, Bob, somebody just walked in with a badge and a letter saying they wanted all these school Medicaid records. And here's what the deal was. In that state, the legislature, whenever they're looking to maybe create a bill or pass a law about something, they have their own auditing department in the legislature that can audit public records. And so in this state, their legislature was looking at something to do with school Medicaid, and they just wanted information. So they send their audit department, who has the authority at the state level to look at these records, out to look for them. They, unlike a normal regular Medicaid audit, they didn't send them a letter saying, hey, we'll be there in 3 weeks. They just showed up. So could be different agencies, could be little to no timing. And generally speaking, I will say most of the time, these auditors are there for a specific purpose. So when the legislature in this state was looking at school Medicaid, they weren't looking at making massive global changes to school Medicaid. They were looking to maybe pass a law on one component of school Medicaid, maybe the random moment time study. And I'm just making that up because I don't really know. When the auditors come in from an agency like that, they probably don't know anything about school Medicaid. They may not know anything about special education or free care or FERPA or anything like that. And so it's not unusual for people to walk in and say, give me everything. Well, if you can find out what the purpose is, you're going to do yourself a favor, and you're going to do the auditors a big favor too, okay? They may have a very specific records requirement, or they may not know what they're looking for and just say, hey, give me everything. So here are some strategies in one of these kind of extraordinary or special audits. First, make sure the auditors have proper authority to access these records. You are still required to meet all FERPA confidentiality and privacy regulations. So before you hand these things over, make sure that these people have the authority to see this stuff. Generally they do, but sometimes they might not. Second, I always recommend that you communicate to these auditors their FERPA obligations, because when you give them access to these records, they are now covered by FERPA obligations, not to give them out any further, you know, those sort of things. But they need to, in my opinion, acknowledge that. So I always recommend to my customers that if you are hit with an extraordinary audit like this, whether it's a federal audit or a state audit, that you give them something, making sure that they know their obligations under FERPA, and make them sign something that says, yes, I understand that I'm under FERPA obligations. Okay. Next one, if you can get them to tell you in specificity what records they're looking for, you're going to help them out. Now, I realize a lot of times when auditors show up in these kind of special cases, they don't want you going into the files. They want to see the files the way they are. And I get that. But if they don't really know what they're looking for, they just want everything, you're really going to try and help them out by saying, well, what do you need? Do you need information about the random moment time study? Because if you do, I'm not going to give you all this stuff about the IEP. Okay, so if you can, great. And the last one there, which again, most of these special auditors probably won't allow this, but if you can prepare the records, just like we talked about before with a cover sheet and a checklist and all that stuff, tabbing the records, you're going to help them out big time, even if they don't recognize that. All right, a few other considerations. People have asked me these questions over the years. Bob, we have an electronic system, electronic IEP, electronic attendance. We have an electronic tracking system that our providers put in their session notes. Should I just give the auditors electronic access? Generally, my answer to that is no. If at all possible, if they demand it, maybe you have to give it to them. But generally, I suggest that you not, mostly because it may be difficult to restrict them to just the information you need or they need to see. So in a lot of IEP systems, you can grant a user access to Bob Bundy as a student. And maybe they need to look at Bob Bundy's IEP from 2015, 2016. But once you give them access to Bob Bundy, they can see everything in Bob's record. Now, some systems allow you to just give them access to the 15-16 IEP, but maybe they just need access to the services page or the services section. And some systems, a lot of systems don't really let you restrict access down to that level. The other one is that a lot of online software systems would not necessarily have a really robust audit trail. So I might have an audit trail that says Bob got in, Bob the auditor got in, and he looked at John Smith, the student's record, but it might stop there. It might not say Bob looked at this IEP and this IEP and this IEP and this page and this page and this section. It might not give you that. And so again, it's kind of a FERPA sort of issue. Second question people ask me is, Bob, should we give them access to the complete file? And again, kind of goes back to a couple things I've talked about. One, there's a FERPA issue. If they're going through everything for 10 years, they don't really need to see that for this audit. The other thing is, if you give them the complete file for a student that's been there 10 years, it's going to take them a long time to find the information, wade through it all to find what they're looking for. So I suggest, obviously, that you don't do that. Unless, again, you have to. Last one, or next one is, let me talk about free care real quick. This is a big concern of mine for states that are adopting free care. And again, we have a free care Lunchinars scheduled for the second half of the school year, but I'm not going to really talk about what free care is today, but more and more states are looking at free care and adopting it in their school Medicaid program. So before free care came out, when auditors came to a school district to do an audit, almost all the records were located in the special education department. As a matter of fact, the vast majority were located in the special education department. Under free care, the students who are receiving services that are being reimbursed by Medicaid may have nothing to do with special education. They've never received special education services. There is no file for them in special education. So we have parental consent forms over here in all these special ed files, but we've got these students over here receiving services. They don't have a special ed file. Where is the parental consent? If you think about the notice, the letter that we showed at the beginning of the session today, that had 10 services on it. Maybe the first 8 are all services that are listed on some student's IEP someplace, and all that information to support that is over in the special education department. But the last 2 kids have no files in special education. So where's their parental consent? Where is their authorizing document? Maybe it's a 504 plan or an individual health plan, or maybe it's none of those things. Where are those? And that's my biggest concern at the school district level about free care, is integrating that in their operations. And so right now there are, I think, 6 or 7 states, California, New Jersey, no, not New Jersey, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, a handful of other ones that have adopted free care and are now allowing reimbursement for these kind of services. And you need to be really sure, if you are a school district in one of those states, that you have your operations in place, especially for an audit, so you know where all your paperwork is. And if any of you are from billing companies and your customers are in free care states, you really need to work closely with them to help them get their processes in place. Last one I have here is a self-audit. I always recommend to my customers a self-audit, regardless of the size of school district, probably a couple times a year. It's better, in my opinion, if you catch issues before auditors catch them. And so I always suggest that you go through the exact same process. If your auditors would normally audit you for 50 records, don't go pull 50 records, maybe pull 15. Something like that, or 10 or something like that, but randomly pull them, create a cover sheet, look for all the supporting documentation behind it, put it all together, just like you would for a regular audit. And then look at the results. If anything would fail the audit, you have a couple things you need to do. One, you might need to file for an adjustment. We just looked at a record. It's not supported because we don't have this signature, whatever it is, and we're never going to get it, but we were reimbursed for that. So in your self-audit, you've identified a service that you have received reimbursement for that you shouldn't have. So you probably need to notify your Medicaid agency with your normal adjustment process. Then you need to investigate, why did this record fail? Was it a one-time thing? Something just fell through the cracks, don't know how that happened, or is it a systemic issue? And I have seen systemic issues, a school district that has, no process around filing. And I'm just going to make up a few things here of filing. And so they don't know where stuff is. A school district where the physical therapists did not receive adequate professional development on electronic signature. So they have no electronic signatures for any of their PT services. Things like that. Investigate. If it's a systemic issue, then the next step is to create your own internal corrective action plan. What you're going to do about it. We're going to provide professional development. We're going to do self-audit every month for the next 3 months, and then assess and see if our corrective action plan has taken care of it. These are the things we're going to do. And then at the end of your corrective action plan, what the result is. Maybe we did another audit and we passed 100%. So write all those things down and then implement it. Now, I always recommend that you document everything in your self-audit. I've talked to people who recommend that you don't and that you shred everything. I think it's a good idea to have proof of it. So if the auditors come in a real audit and they find an issue, you can say to them, we're on top of our program. Matter of fact, here's what happens whenever we find an issue. We've done this, we've done this, we've done this. We've cleaned up our act over the last 5 years, and here's how we've done it. The one thing that you pointed out in your audit is an anomaly, but we're going to take care of it, and it's never going to happen again. I think if you show that kind of proactivity to the auditors, they're less likely to ding you with a massive finding. They're more likely to say, oh, this school district knows exactly what they're doing, and they've taken care of it. Okay, a couple of resources to give you guys. On our webpage, on the resources tab at the very bottom, you scroll all the way down, you see circled there, Medicaid audits. You can go out and basically we have links to every single OIG school Medicaid audit since about 2001. Go out and read those. Here's my contact information again. Anybody wants to reach out, I would love to visit with you. Thanks.